This is a reading of the Wikipedia article on East Germany. East Germany, officially the German Democratic Republic, or in German the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, existed from 1949 to 1990, the period when the eastern portion of Germany was a state that was part of the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. It described itself as a socialist workers' and peasant state, and the territory was administered and occupied by Soviet forces at the end of World War II, the Soviet occupation zone of the Potsdam Agreement, bounded on the east by the Oder-Neisse line. The Soviet zone surrounded West Berlin but did not include it. As a result, West Berlin remained outside the jurisdiction of the GDR. The German Democratic Republic was established in the Soviet zone, while the Federal Republic was established in the three Western zones. East Germany was a satellite state of the Soviet Union. Soviet occupation authorities began transferring administrative responsibility to German communist leaders in 1948, and the GDR began to function as a state on the 7th of October 1949. However, Soviet forces remained in the country throughout the Cold War. Until 1989, the GDR was governed by the Socialist Unity Party, or the SED, though other parties nominally participated in its alliance organisation, the National Front of Democratic Germany. The SED made the teaching of Marxism-Leninism and the Russian language compulsory in schools. The economy was centrally planned and increasingly state-owned. Prices of housing, basic goods and services were set by central government planners rather than rising and falling through supply and demand, and were heavily subsidised. Although the GDR had to pay substantial war reparations to the USSR, it became the most successful economy in the Eastern Bloc. Emigration to the West was a significant problem, as many of the emigrants were well-educated young people. It further weakened the state economically. The government fortified its western borders and in 1961 built the Berlin Wall. Many people attempting to flee were killed by border guards or booby traps such as landmines. Several others were imprisoned for many years. In 1989, numerous social, economic and political forces in the GDR and abroad led to the fall of the Berlin Wall and the establishment of a government committed to liberalisation. The following year, open elections were held, and international negotiations led to the signing of the final settlement treaty on the status and borders of Germany. The GDR dissolved itself, and Germany was reunified on the 3rd of October 1990, becoming a fully sovereign state again. Several of the GDR's leaders, notably its last communist leader, Egon Krenz, were prosecuted in reunified Germany for crimes committed during the Cold War. Geographically, the German Democratic Republic bordered the Baltic Sea to the north, Poland to the east, Czechoslovakia to the southeast, and West Germany to the southwest and west. Internally, the GDR also bordered the Soviet sector of Allied-occupied Berlin, known as East Berlin, which was also administered as the state's de facto capital. It also bordered the three sectors occupied by the United States, the United Kingdom and France, known collectively as West Berlin. The three sectors occupied by the Western nations were sealed off from the rest of the GDR by the Berlin Wall from its construction in 1961 until it was brought down in 1989. Naming conventions. The official name was the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, or the German Democratic Republic, usually abbreviated to DDR. Both terms were used in East Germany, with increasing usage of the abbreviated form, especially since East Germany considered West Germans and West Berliners to be foreigners, following the promulgation of its second constitution in 1968. West Germans, the Western media and statesmen initially avoided the official name and its abbreviation, instead using terms like Ostzone or Eastern Zone, or the Sowjetische Besatzungszone or Soviet Occupation Zone, often abbreviated to SBZ, and the sogenannte DDR, or the so-called GDR. The centre of political power in East Berlin was referred to as Pankow. The seat of command of the Soviet forces in East Germany was referred to as Karlshorst. Over time, however, the abbreviation DDR was also increasingly used colloquially by West Germans and the West German media. The term Westdeutschland, or West Germany, when used by West Germans, was almost always a reference to the geographic region of Western Germany, and not to the area within the boundaries of the Federal Republic of Germany. However, this use was not always consistent. For example, West Berliners frequently used the term Westdeutschland to denote the Federal Republic. Before World War II, Ostdeutschland, or Eastern Germany, was used to describe all of the territories east of the Elbe, East Elbia, as reflected in the works of the sociologists Max Weber and the political theorist Carl Schmitt. History. Explaining the internal impact of the DDR regime from the perspective of German history in the long term, historian Gerhard A. Ritter in 2002 has argued that the East German state was defined by two dominant forces, Soviet communism on the one hand, and German traditions filtered through the interwar experiences of German communists on the other. It was always constrained by the powerful example of the increasingly prosperous West, to which East Germans compared their nation. The changes wrought by the communists were most apparent in ending capitalism and transforming industry and agriculture, in the militarization of society, and in the political thrust of the educational system and the media. On the other hand, there was relatively little change made in the historically independent domains of the sciences, the engineering professions, the Protestant churches, and in many bourgeois lifestyles. Social policy, says Ritter, became a critical legitimization tool in the last decades and mixed socialist and traditional elements about equally. Origins. At the Yalta Conference during World War II, the Allies, the US, the UK and the Soviet Union agreed on dividing a defeated Nazi Germany into occupation zones and on dividing Berlin, the German capital, among the Allied powers as well. Initially, this meant the construction of 3 zones of occupation, i.e. American, British and Soviet. Later, a French zone was carved out of the American and British zones. The 1949 establishment. The ruling Communist Party, known as the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, or the SED, was formed in April 1946 from the merger between the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, by mandate of Joseph Stalin. The two former parties were notorious rivals when they were active before the Nazis consolidated all power and criminalised their agitation. The unification of the two parties was symbolic of the new friendship of German socialists in defeating their common enemy. However, the communists who held a majority had virtually total control over policy. The SED was the ruling party for the entire duration of the East German state. It had close ties with the USSR, which maintained military forces in East Germany until its dissolution in 1991. The Russian Federation continued to maintain forces in what had been East Germany until 1994, with the stated purpose of countering NATO bases in West Germany. Historians debate whether the decision to form a separate country was initiated by the USSR or the SED. As West Germany was reorganised and gained independence from its occupiers, the German Democratic Republic was established in East Germany in 1949. The creation of the two states solidified the 1945 division of Germany. On the 10th of March 1952, in what would become known as the Stalin Note, Stalin put forth a proposal to reunify Germany with a policy of neutrality, with no conditions on economic policies, and with guarantees for the rights of man and basic freedoms, including freedom of speech, press, religious persuasion, political conviction and assembly, and free activity of democratic parties and organisations. This was turned down. Reunification was not a priority for the leadership of West Germany, and the NATO powers declined the proposal, asserting that Germany should be able to join NATO and that such a negotiation with the Soviet Union would be seen as a capitulation. There had been several debates about whether a real chance for reunification had been missed in 1952. In 1949, the Soviets turned control of East Germany over to the Socialist Unity Party, headed by Wilhelm Pieck, who lived from 1876 to 1960, who became president of the GDR and held the office until his death, while most executive authority was assumed by the SED General Secretary Walter Ulbricht. Socialist leader Otto Grotewohl, who lived from 1894 to 1964, became Prime Minister until his death. The government of East Germany denounced West German failures in accomplishing denazification and renounced ties to the Nazi past, imprisoning many former Nazis and preventing them from holding government positions. The SED set a primary goal of ridding East Germany of all traces of the fascist regime. The SED party platform claimed to support democratic elections and the protection of individual liberties in building up socialism. Zones of occupation. In the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, the Allies established a joint military occupation and administration of Germany via the Allied Control Council, or the ACC, a four-power US, UK, USSR and France military government, effective until the restoration of German sovereignty. In Eastern Germany, the Soviet occupation zone comprised the 5 states, or Länder, of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Brandenburg, Saxony, Saxony-Anhalt, and Thuringia. Disagreements over the policies to be followed in the occupied zones quickly led to a breakdown in cooperation between the four powers, and the Soviets administered their zone without regard to the policies implemented in the other zones. The Soviets withdrew from the ACC in 1948, subsequently as the other 3 zones were increasingly unified, and granted self-government. The Soviet administration instituted a separate socialist government in its zone. Yet, 7 years after the Allies' Potsdam Agreement to unify Germany, the USSR, via the Stalin Note of the 10th of March 1952, proposed German reunification and superpower disengagement from Central Europe, which the 3 Western Allies, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, rejected. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, a communist proponent of reunification, died in early March 1953. Similarly, Lavrenti Beria, the first deputy prime minister of the USSR, pursued German reunification, but he was removed from power that same year before he could act on the matter. His successor, Nikita Khrushchev, rejected reunification as equivalent to returning East Germany for annexation to the West. Hence, reunification went unconsidered until 1989. East Germany considered East Berlin to be its capital, and the Soviet Union and the rest of the Eastern Bloc diplomatically recognised East Berlin as the capital. However, the Western Allies disputed this recognition, considering the entire city of Berlin to be occupied territory governed by the Allied Control Council. According to Margarita Feinstein, East Berlin's status as the capital was largely unrecognised by the West and most Third World countries. In practice, the ACC's authority was rendered moot by the Cold War, and East Berlin's status as occupied territory largely became a legal fiction, and the former Soviet sector became fully integrated into the GDR. The deepening Cold War conflict between the Western powers and the Soviet Union led to the Berlin blockade of the 24th of June 1948 to the 12th of May 1949. The Soviet army initiated the blockade by halting all Allied rail, road and water traffic to and from West Berlin. The Allies countered the Soviets with the Berlin airlift from 1948 to 1949 of food, fuel and supplies to West Berlin. Partition. On the 21st of April 1946, the Communist Party of Germany and the part of the Social Democratic Party of Germany in the Soviet zone merged to form the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, which then won the elections of 1946, held under the oversight of the Soviet Army. Being a Marxist-Leninist political party, the SED's government nationalised infrastructure and industrial plants. In 1948, the German Economic Commission, the Deutsche Wirtschaftskommission, or DWK, under its chairman Heinrich Rau, assumed administrative authority in the Soviet occupation zone, thus becoming the predecessor of an East German government. On the 7th of October 1949, the SED established the Deutsche Demokratische Republik, or the German Democratic Republic, GDR, based on a socialist political constitution, establishing its control of the anti-fascist National Front of the German Democratic Republic, an omnibus alliance of every party and mass organisation in East Germany. The NF was established to stand for election to the Volkskammer, or the People's Chamber, the East German Parliament. The first and only president of the German Democratic Republic was Wilhelm Pieck. However, after 1950, political power in East Germany was held by the first secretary of the SED, Walter Ulbricht. On the 16th of June 1953, workers constructing the new Stalin Alley Boulevard in East Berlin, according to the 16 Principles of Urban Design, rioted against a 10% production quota increase. Initially a labour protest, it soon included the general populace, and on the 17th of June, similar protests occurred throughout the GDR, with more than 1 million people striking in some 700 cities and towns. Fearing anti-communist counter-revolution, on the 18th of June 1953, the government of the GDR enlisted the Soviet occupation forces to aid the police in ending the riot. Some 50 people were killed and 10,000 jailed. The German war reparations owed to the USSR impoverished the Soviet zone of occupation and severely weakened the East German economy. In the 1945-46 period, the Soviets confiscated and transported to the USSR approximately 33% of the industrial plant, and by the early 1950s had extracted some $10 billion in reparations in agricultural and industrial products. The poverty of East Germany, induced by reparations, provoked the Republikflucht, or desertion from the Republic, to West Germany, further weakening the GDR's economy. Western economic opportunities induced a brain drain. In response, the GDR closed the inner German border, and on the night of the 12th of August 1961, East German soldiers began erecting the Berlin Wall. In 1971, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev had Ulbricht removed. Erich Honecker replaced him. While the Ulbricht government had experimented with liberal reforms, the Honecker government reversed them. The new government introduced a new East German constitution, which defined the German Democratic Republic as a republic of workers and peasants. Initially, East Germany claimed an exclusive mandate for all of Germany, a claim supported by most of the communist bloc. It claimed that West Germany was an illegally constituted NATO puppet state. However, from the 1960s onward, East Germany began recognising itself as a separate country from West Germany and shared the legacy of the United German State of 1871 to 1945. This was formalised in 1974 when the reunification clause was removed from the revised East German constitution. West Germany, in contrast, maintained that it was the only legitimate government of Germany. From 1949 to the early 1970s, West Germany maintained that East Germany was an illegally constituted state. It argued that the GDR was a Soviet puppet state and frequently referred to it as the Soviet occupation zone. This position was shared by West Germany's allies as well until 1973. East Germany was recognised primarily by communist countries and the Arab bloc, along with some scattered sympathisers. According to the Holstein Doctrine of 1955, West Germany also did not establish formal diplomatic ties with any country, except the USSR, that recognised East German sovereignty. But in the early 1970s, the Ostpolitik, or Eastern policy, of change through rapprochement of the pragmatic government of FRG Chancellor Willy Brandt established normal diplomatic relations with the East Bloc states. This policy saw the Treaty of Moscow of August 1970, the Treaty of Warsaw of December 1970, the Four-Power Agreement on Berlin of September 1971, the Transit Agreement of May 1972, and the Basic Treaty of December 1972, which relinquished any claims to an exclusive mandate over Germany as a whole and established normal relations between the Germanys. Both countries were admitted into the United Nations on the 18th of September 1973. This also increased the number of countries recognising East Germany to 55, including the US, the UK and France, though these three still refused to recognise East Berlin as the capital and insisted on a specific provision in the UN resolution accepting the two Germanys into the UN to that effect. Following the Ostpolitik, the West German view was that the East Germany was a de facto government within a single German nation and a de jure state organisation of parts of Germany outside the Federal Republic. The Federal Republic continued to maintain that it could not within its own structures recognise the GDR as de jure as a sovereign state under international law, but it fully acknowledged that, within the structures of international law, the GDR was an independent sovereign state. By distinction, West Germany then viewed itself as being within its own boundaries, not only the de facto and de jure government, but also the sole de jure legitimate representative of a dominant Germany as a whole. The two Germanys relinquished any claim to represent the other internationally, which they acknowledged as necessarily implying a mutual recognition of each other as both capable of representing their own populations de jure in participating in international bodies and agreements, such as the United Nations and the Helsinki Final Act. Travel between the GDR and Poland, Czechoslovakia and Hungary became visa-free from 1972. GDR identity. From the beginning, the newly formed GDR tried to establish its own separate identity. Because of the imperial and military legacy of Prussia, the SED repudiated continuity between Prussia and the GDR. The SED destroyed a number of symbolic relics of the former Prussian aristocracy. The Junker manor houses were torn down, the Berliner Stadtschloss was razed, and the equestrian statue of Frederick the Great was removed from East Berlin. Instead, the SED focused on the progressive heritage of German history, including Thomas Munzer's role in the German Peasants' War and the role played by the heroes of the class struggle during Prussia's industrialisation. Especially after the Ninth Policy Congress in 1976, East Germany upheld historical reformers such as Karl Freiherr von Stein, Karl August von Hardenberg, Wilhelm von Humboldt, and Gerhard von Scharnhorst as examples and role models. Die Wende, or German reunification. In 1989, following widespread public anger over the faking of results of local government elections, many citizens applied for exit visas or left the country, contrary to GDR laws. In August 1989, Hungary removed its border restrictions and unsealed its border, and more than 13,000 people left East Germany by crossing the border via Czechoslovakia into Hungary and then on to Austria and West Germany. Many others demonstrated against the ruling party, especially in the city of Leipzig. Kurt Masur, the conductor of the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra, led local negotiations with the government and held town meetings in the concert hall. The demonstrations eventually led Erich Honecker to resign in October, and he was replaced by a slightly more moderate communist, Egon Krenz. On the 9th of November 1989, a few sections of the Berlin Wall were opened, resulting in thousands of East Germans crossing freely into West Berlin and West Germany for the first time in nearly 30 years. Krenz resigned a few days later, and the SED abandoned power shortly afterward. Although there were some limited attempts to create a permanent democracy in East Germany, this did not come to pass. East Germany held its last elections in March 1990. The winner was a coalition headed by the East German branch of West Germany's Christian Democratic Union, which advocated speedy reunification. Negotiations, the 2+4 talks, were held involving the two German states and the former Allies, which led to an agreement on the conditions for German reunification. By a two-thirds vote in the Volkskammer on the 23rd of August 1990, the German Democratic Republic declared its accession to the Federal Republic of Germany. The 5 original East German states that had been abolished in the 1952 redistricting were restored. On the 3rd of October 1990, the 5 states officially joined the Federal Republic of Germany, while East and West Berlin united as this third city-state in the same manner as Bremen and Hamburg. On the 1st of July, a currency union preceded the political union. The Ostmark was abolished, and the West German Deutsche Mark became common currency. Although the Volkskammer's declaration of accession to the Federal Republic had initiated the process of reunification, the act of reunification itself, with its many specific terms, conditions and qualifications, some of which involved amendments to the West German Basic Law, was achieved constitutionally by the subsequent Unification Treaty of the 31st of August 1990, that is, through a binding agreement between the former Democratic Republic and the Federal Republic, now recognising each other as separate sovereign entities in international law. This treaty was then voted into effect prior to the agreed date for reunification by both the Volkskammer and the Bundestag by the constitutionally required two-thirds majorities, effecting on the one hand the extinction of the GDR and on the other the agreed amendments to the Basic Law of the Federal Republic. The great economic and socio-political inequalities between the former Germanys required government subsidy for the full integration of the Democratic Republic of Germany into the German Federal Republic. Because of the resulting deindustrialization in the former East Germany, the causes of the failure of this integration continue to be debated. Some Western commentators claim that the depressed Eastern economy is a natural after-effect of a demonstrably inefficient command economy. But many East German critics contend that the shock therapy style of privatisation, the artificially high rate of exchange offered for the Ostmark, and the speed with which the entire process was implemented did not leave room for East German enterprises to adapt. Politics. There were 4 periods in East German political history. These included 1949 to 1961, which saw the building of socialism. 1961 to 1970, after the Berlin Wall closed off escape, was a period of stability and consolidation. And 1971 to 1985 was termed the Honecker era and saw closer ties with West Germany. And 1985 to 1989 saw the decline and extinction of West Germany. Organisation. The ruling political party in East Germany was the Sozialistische Einheitspartei Deutschlands, or the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, the SED. It was created in 1946 through the Soviet-directed merger of the Communist Party of Germany, the KPD, and the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, in the Soviet-controlled zone. However, the SED quickly transformed into a full-fledged communist party as the more independent-minded Social Democrats were pushed out. The Potsdam Agreement committed the Soviets to supporting a democratic form of government in Germany through the Soviets' understanding of democracy, was radically different from that of the West. As in other Soviet bloc countries, non-communist political parties were allowed. Nevertheless, every political party in the GDR was forced to join the National Front of Germany, a broad coalition of parties, and massive political organisations. The member parties were almost completely subservient to the SED and had to accept its leading role as a condition of their existence. However, the parties did have representation in the Volkskammer and received some posts in the government. The Volkskammer also included representatives from the mass organisations, like the Free German Youth or the Free German Trade Union Federation. There was also a Democratic Women's Federation of Germany with seats in the Volkskammer. Important non-parliamentary mass organisations in East German society included the German Gymnastics and Sports Association and People's Solidarity, an organisation for the elderly. Another society of note was the Society for German-Soviet Friendship. After the fall of communism, the SED was renamed the Party of Democratic Socialism, which continued for a decade after reunification before merging with the West German WASG to form the Left Party, or Die Linke. The Left Party continues to be a political force in many parts of Germany, albeit drastically less powerful than the SED. Population. The East German population declined by 3 million people throughout its 41-year history, from 19 million in 1948 to 16 million in 1990. Of the 1948 population, some 4 million were deported from the lands east of the Oder-Neisse line. This was a stark contrast from Poland, which increased during that time from 24 million in 1950, a little more than East Germany, to 38 million, more than twice of East Germany's population. This was primarily a result of emigration. About 1/4 of East Germans left the country before the Berlin Wall was completed in 1961, and after that time, East Germany had a very low birth rate, except for a recovery in the 1980s, when the birth rate in East Germany was considerably higher than in West Germany. The major cities were East Berlin, Leipzig, Dresden, Karl-Marx-Stadt, Magdeburg, Rostock, Halle, Erfurt, Potsdam, Gera, Schwerin, Cottbus, Zwickau, Jena, and Dessau. The administrative districts. Until 1952, East Germany comprised the capital East Berlin, though legally it was not fully part of the GDR's territory, and the 5 German states of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern in 1947 renamed Mecklenburg, Brandenburg, Saxony-Anhalt, Thuringia, and Saxony, their post-war territorial demarcations approximating the pre-war German demarcations of the Middle German Länder and provinces of Prussia. The western parts of 2 provinces, Pomerania and Lower Silesia, the remainder of which were annexed by Poland, remained in the GDR and were attached to Mecklenburg and Saxony respectively. The East German administrative reform of 1952 established 14 Bezirke, or districts, and de facto disestablished the 5 Länder. The new Bezirke, named after their district centres, were as follows: Rostock, Neubrandenburg, and Schwerin, created from the land of Mecklenburg, Potsdam, Frankfurt Oder, and Cottbus from Brandenburg, Magdeburg and Halle from Saxony-Anhalt, Leipzig, Dresden, and Karl-Marx-Stadt, which was Chemnitz until 1953 and again from 1990, from Saxony, and Erfurt, Gera, and Suhl from Thuringia. East Germany was made the country's 15th Bezirk in 1961, but retained special legal status until 1968, when the residents approved the new draft constitution. Despite the city as a whole being legally under the control of the Allied Control Council and diplomatic objections of the Allied governments, the GDR administered the Bezirk of Berlin as part of its territory. Military. The The National Volksarmee, or NVA, was the largest military organisation in East Germany. It was formed in 1956 from the barracked People's Police, the military units of the regular police or Volkspolizei, when East Germany joined the Warsaw Pact. From its creation, it was controlled by the Ministry of National Defence. It was an all-volunteer force until an 18-month conscription period was introduced in 1962. It was regarded by NATO officers as the best military in the Warsaw Pact. The NVA consisted of the following branches: the Army, the Landstreitkräfte, the Navy or the Volksmarine, and the Air Force, the Luftstreitkräfte or Luftverteidigung. Border troops. The border troops of the eastern sector were originally organised as a police force, the Deutsche Grenzpolizei, similar to the Bundesgrenzschutz in West Germany. It was controlled by the Ministry of the Interior. Following the remilitarisation of East Germany in 1956, the Deutsche Grenzpolizei was transformed into a military force in 1961, modelled after the Soviet border troops, and transferred to the Ministry of National Defence as part of the National People's Army. In 1973, it was separated from the NVA, but it remained under the same ministry. At its peak, it numbered approximately 47,000 men. The Volkspolizei. After the NVA was separated from the Volkspolizei in 1956, the Ministry of the Interior maintained its own public order barrack reserve, known as the Volkspolizei Bereitschaften, or VPB. These units were, like the Kasernerte Volkspolizei, equipped as motorised infantry, and they numbered between 12,000 and 15,000 men. The Stasi. The Ministry of State Security, or the Stasi, which was mainly involved with facility security and plainclothes event security. They were the only part of the feared Stasi that was visible to the public and were so very unpopular within the population. The Stasi numbered around 90,000 men, the Guards Regiment around 11,000 to 12,000 men. Combat groups of the working class. The Kampfgruppen der Arbeiterklasse, or combat groups of the working class, numbered around 400,000 for much of their existence and were organised around factories. The KDA was the political military instrument of the SED. It was essentially a party army. All KDA directives and decisions were made by the ZK's Politburo. They received their training from the Volkspolizei and the Ministry of the Interior. Membership was voluntary, but SED members were required to join as part of their membership obligation.